Oh, here is a special guest.
Absolutely, Mr. Greenspan.
Mr. Alan Greenspan, to be precise. It'd be hard to think of a more important guest on the first day of Fox Business than Alan Greenspan, the former Federal Reserve Chairman and current author of the book, The Age of Turbulence, Adventures in a New World, joining us from our Washington studios. Good to see you, Dr. Greenspan. Thanks for coming in.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Appreciate it on our inaugural day. Now, we were looking through some of your more obscure, if I can call it that, comments in which you were trying to be a little obscure back in the days when you were head of the Fed. I just wonder why, instead of going through all the stuff you had to go through to avoid answering a direct question, why didn't you just say no comment? Were you allowed to do that?
You are, but regrettably, for a number of questions, no comment is an answer. And
explain,
so we're caught
please.
in the, well, for example, somebody can ask me a question whether or not we are about to take a certain type of action. No comment has possible interpretations, which means yes to some and no to others. And I decided that avoiding no comment was a very good idea if I could do it.
So it's easier to obscure by using more words than less sometimes.
It worked exceptionally well.
Now, you did use some interesting words at various times. For example, your phrase irrational exuberance, when the market was climbing up, you did that in a speech. I was actually there at an AEI speech in 1996. Now, the market didn't react immediately. It did react for a day or two, but it continued on its upward rise until the bubble finally burst in 2000. Were you trying to get the bubble to burst at the time you said it in 96?
Well, it was not quite that, but I was trying, as indeed the Secretary of the Treasury was trying, to convey that perhaps the market was a little more exuberant than could be sustained over the long run. And I guess what we meant by the long run is half a century.
That's a long run. You look a little further down the line than the people down on the floor do. Now, we want to show a copy of your book, which is a terrific book explaining the insides, particularly for wonks like me, but you don't have to be a wonk to appreciate some of the stories you tell. The corporate scandals, some of which happened just after the time that the bubble burst in 2000, 2001, Enron, WorldCom, Tyco, et cetera, were they related to the irrational exuberance? Was there something related there, or was it just coincidental that they happened around the same time?
No, I do think that when you get to a state of euphoria, which is which occurs all the time historically, human beings, as I point out in the book, are prone to a continuous state of euphoria which builds up and then it collapses into despair or fear. We don't know how to cure that, and I doubt very much if we can. But the euphoria stage creates a great deal of liquidity, and liquidity creates a lot of sloppy practices, and that goes for accounting as well as a number of other things. So directly was Enron the result of that? No, but indirectly I think it was.
Now, some folks have looked to the housing bubble and said that that in fact is a bubble, that it's not a real reflection of the value of the properties that have been going sky high. We've seen them drop down, but even now they're sky high compared to what they were 5 years ago. Is there a similarity between the housing bubble, if I can call it that, and what we saw with the dot-com era 5, 6 years ago?
Well, I think the housing bubble, which exists, if I may put it this way, in perhaps more than 24 countries around the world, is, in my judgment, as I try to point out in my book, the consequence of a significant decline in real long-term interest rates, which in turn results from events that occurred subsequent to the decline of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. It was a geopolitical switch in which market capitalism very quietly overtook central planning, and that created substantial booms throughout the world, especially in the developing world, which, for reasons I get to in the book, created an excess of savings which drove down long-term interest rates virtually everywhere. And virtually everywhere, it sprouted a housing bubble because, as we're acutely aware in all of real estate, as capitalization ratios fall, prices go up.
Now, would that have happened no matter who was guiding the Federal Reserve at that time? Because some people do say, beyond these geopolitical developments that were putting pressure downward on interest rates, you particularly really pushed those rates even lower.
No, the rates that we at the Fed pushed lower were short-term rates. But what creates housing prices are maturities from 4 years out to maybe 15. And they were very significantly governed by this major change in geopolitical events. And central banks gradually began to lose the power of affecting longer-term rates, as we demonstrated rather conclusively in 2004 when we raised short-term rates very rapidly and ended up with no increase whatsoever in long-term rates. And indeed, it stayed that way into 2005 as we continued to tighten. What that demonstrated, which has been true pretty much around the world, is that central banks no longer have the capacity to significantly impact on longer-term rates, and it's the longer-term rates which create bubbles.
So then, why do we need a central bank?
Well, the question is a very interesting one. We have, at this particular stage, a fiat money, which is essentially money printed by a government, and it's usually the central bank which is authorized to do so. Some mechanism has got to be in place that restricts the amount of money which is produced, either a gold standard or currency board or something of that nature, because unless you do that, all of history suggests that inflation will take hold with very deleterious effects on economic activity.
Now, you were a great admirer, in fact, an accolade of Ayn Rand, the great philosopher who believed that in the absolute most limited role that the government could play in people's lives. She probably wouldn't have been a fan of the Federal Reserve Board, would she?
Well, I don't know, because we never discussed that in particular. But I think she recognized that there are lots of institutions which we would be better without, but nonetheless probably require them if indeed society as a whole decides to do that. Remember, we live in a democratic society, and that compromise is the very essence of a democratic society, because if we're all individuals with different ideas and we want to live together, we have to do that. And there are numbers of us, myself included, who strongly believe that we did very well in the 1870 to 1914 period with an international gold standard.
Yeah, we did well without the Federal Reserve. People forget.